So I would never discourage anybody from coming to Africa. But, however, if I'm being honest with myself, I feel like the development of Africa should not just be a thing for Africans. It should be building a pyramid, building a fortress for black people all around the world. I would place culture immediately after jobs. My first point would be jobs. My second point would be culture. Know that you might have to adapt to the practice or the principles of another culture. All in all, the point I think is the most important in this video is that which has to do with economics. Before you come to Africa, make sure that your flow of income is independent of your being in Africa. If you can afford it, visit and then think about it. And finally, I would advise you. We have seen African Americans pack their things, get on the plane, and leave for Ghana or for several countries in Africa, intending to stay in these countries permanently, which is understandable. But unfortunately, on getting to Africa, they are confronted with realities that they never foresaw before leaving the US. And after some short months, they find themselves on the plane going back to the very US they had been escaping from, going back to face the same problems they had been escaping from in the US. So this video tries to explain to us why this happens. Why is it that African Americans, upon coming to Africa with plans to stay long term, find themselves going back? What is it about Africa that makes it not an ideal destination for long term, for Americans or African Americans to live in the long term? I will watch this video with you guys and I will give my own input. I hope to participate in furthering the enlightenment as far as this subject is concerned. Let's go.
2019 marked the year of return and 400 years since the arrival of the first slaves to the U.S. This coincided with the call for African Americans to return to their homelands. And since then, thousands of black Americans have in fact been paying heed to the call and making the move to Africa. Most of the diaspora have been moving to Ghana, but many others have also moved to places like Senegal, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Rwanda, and South Africa. The reasons for leaving the U.S. transcend an ancestral calling. For many, it's the fractured race relations and an existential trauma that exists in the African American psyche since slavery. This all came to a boiling point after the murder of George Floyd in 2020. For many, it was a wake-up call that America wasn't really where they belong, and so they packed their bags in search of more welcoming lands. For many, their new home in Africa was blissful.
I remember after the death of George Floyd, how there was this general sentiment that was perceptible even across the Atlantic, that America was just unsafe, was not the place to be. And a friend of mine, I and a friend were having a conversation. I do not think that systematic oppression or racism towards black people is limited to America. When this George Floyd thing happened, a friend of mine and I were just discussing about how if you look across the world to all the continents that are inhabited by multiracial countries and communities and continents around the world, there seems to be a trend where black people are always at the bottom, like socially, politically, and economically, especially economically. It always looks like black people are at the bottom. In South America, in Brazil, the favelas, it's mostly black people living there. In Colombia, in the outskirts, it's mostly black people living there. There's a community of black people in India that no one even knows about. They live in the outskirts. They get nothing. The same thing in Pakistan. There's a community of black people in Pakistan. If you look around the world, you would find pockets of black people that are oppressed almost everywhere. And so we were having a conversation about how much of a pity it is that Africa does not have the economic backbone to serve as a mother hen to all the black people around the world. Like, Africans, black people suffering from oppression all around the world should be able to turn back and look to Africa as, a source of protection and a source of sustenance. But unfortunately, when you turn back and look, what you see there does not encourage you either. And we were just talking about how much of a tragedy it is that, things are this way. It's a bad reflection on us Africans that we cannot offer help at the moment to black people all around the world. I feel like the development of Africa should not just be a thing for Africans. It should be building a pyramid, building a fortress for black people all around the world. So these were the conversations we were having.
A warmer climate, a lower cost of living, better quality food, and a sense of belonging without the day-to-day challenges of both subtle and more overt racism that confronted them in America. However, not everybody had the soft landing they were hoping for. In this video, we'll look at why some African Americans end up returning to the U.S. after making the move to Africa. We found that there are 4 main reasons. First up, no jobs. Many African Americans hold the misconception that when they arrive in whichever African country they move to that they'll be able to easily get a job. This simply isn't the case. Unlike the U.S., jobs in most African countries are scarce, with unemployment rates sometimes being as high as 50%. Western world conveniences.
Briefly about the jobs thing. If you are moving to Africa for the long term, I would strongly advise that you have your source of income independent of Africa. The economy to which you're migrating is probably struggling with creating jobs for its own people. You know what I mean? Employment rates run very high in my country. Youth unemployment rate run very high in Africa in general. In my country, for example, they stand at around 30%. You know, and that is like the average. If you check statistics for most African countries, you'd find youth employment standing at around 30%, you know, thereabouts in most countries. It's not wise, therefore, for you to think that you'll be able to find a job when the very citizens of the country themselves are struggling finding employment. I totally agree. That has to be the first point.
A lot of the diaspora often fail to recognize how cushy their lifestyles are in the West. Only when arriving in Africa do they realize what they've taken for granted. Simple examples include basic road infrastructure with sidewalks. A lot of African countries may have tarred roads, but often don't have sidewalks. This means that walking from A to B often isn't an option. So you find yourself driving or taking taxis everywhere. Another example is online shopping. In the US, one can buy an item on Amazon using one-click checkout and it'll be with you later that day. E-commerce may well exist in Africa, but getting an item delivered to you may not be possible. This is because many parts of Africa don't have traditional addresses. The houses don't have names or numbers, and street names often don't exist. As a result, people often have to revert to providing landmark references such as the yellow house opposite the post office next to the park. For some folks, not having these Western conveniences is more important than they realized, and before long they start to miss the comforts of American living and end up moving back. Culture. African Americans.
That's right, like facilities. The facilities, the social system, the institutions do not work. And we have exactly the same problem. These are things that we complain about as well. And they are things that require large-scale measures to fix, and a lot of time. And you know, infrastructure has to be put up, institutions have to be set up, and a lot of changes have to be made at the societal and the structural level for them to be fixed. But they are problems that we deal with all the time. And like he was saying, it may just be at that point that you realize that those things meant a lot more to you than you thought they did. I agree too with the second point.
Often erroneously believe that when they move to Africa, they'll fit right into the culture like a hand in a glove. This is very rarely the case. Although their ancestors may hail from the African country they have moved to, being so many generations removed from this country means that culturally they have very little in common with these people. Lack of choice. America is...
I was just going to say about the culture that it's very true. African societies are governed by societal norms that are deeply entrenched in cultural values. So a lot of the things that would fly in the American society would not fly in African societies. I think Americans have more liberty in the way that they conduct their lives. Young people can do whatever they want, can dress in whatever style fits them. They can engage with members of the opposite sex in, in a more liberal manner. But in Africa, a lot of that would be frowned upon. Like having dreadlocks, for example, would not fly in most African households. Putting an earring on your ear, like having an earring, would not fly as well. Putting your trousers at a certain angle on your bottom would not fly. A lot of things that are considered just socially acceptable and the way of life in the American society would definitely not fly in an African household. So a lot of it has to do with culture. And then what he also said about religion is very important, because religion plays a significant role in African society. In my town, on Sundays, for example, from say 9 a.m. to 2 p.m., the streets are empty. Everyone is in church, right? So it's a deeply religious community. The same thing goes for communities, for countries that are majority Muslim. Everyone goes to the mosque. So a lot of our societal values are extracted from that religious doctrine or dogma. So it may just be a little bit shocking. Also, you might be Christian in America, and then you move to Senegal, for example, and it's a Muslim country. If you had not thought about that previously, it may take you a little bit off guard, because Muslim societies don't function in the same way as Christian societies. I would place culture immediately after jobs. My first point would be jobs. Know that it's not going to be easy to get a job. My second point would be culture. Know that you might have to adapt to the practice or the principles of another culture that is foreign to you. But I dare say that you would, in terms of culture, you would come to appreciate it. I dare say you would come to appreciate it, because African societies are largely conservative. And I find that if you are a parent, for example, you definitely want your child to grow up in a society that is a little bit more conservative. I mean, I'm just saying, I find it that way. I would rather I live in a conservative society that has strong cultural norms than to live in a society that is just loose like that and it doesn't have specific tenets for what is right and what is wrong, what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. So I dare say even though it might seem strange to you at first, but as time goes on, if you do stay, you would come to appreciate African values.
Perhaps more the land of plenty than the land of the free. You never have a lack of choice when making a decision in America. If you want to book a flight from New York to Los Angeles, you can choose from more than 6 different airlines. In most African countries, you may only have one airline to choose from. If you want to furnish a house or apartment, you have a cornucopia of choice when it comes to sofas, rugs, and tables and chairs. In Africa, this choice will most certainly be more limited. The lack of choice makes things more one-dimensional and also will invariably mean that prices on goods and services will be greater.
Then you want to go ahead and buy the items that you're so used to, whether it's dishwashing liquid, whether it is clothing, whether it is, whether it's cleaning items, whether it is, the food, or whether any item that's got to be imported in, it is going to be a task on your pockets.
All in all, the point I think is the most important in this video is that which has to do with economics. Before you come to Africa, make sure that your flow of income is independent of your being in Africa. If your plan is to get to Africa and then find something to do to generate money or to generate income, you're making a big mistake. Other things like culture, like lack of choice, like, some of these things you can find your way around, and it's a lot more easy for you if you can secure the same salary you earn in the US, or maybe slightly less, while living in Africa. A lot of these other challenges would be a lot easier for you to get around. If you can secure your income, I greatly advise you to move to an African country. If you can secure your income, all the other challenges, if you are wealthy enough, you can get around them. You can get whatever you want if you're earning enough. Also, with the same salary that you earn in the US, in Africa, you would live a lifestyle that is far above the lifestyle of any African. You would find yourself instantly among the top, I don't know, top 30%. So it's going to be easier for you to have a good time and to live a good life. So if I were to give you advice, I would say first, make sure that you secure your finances and that you are able to find a source of income that is not dependent on the African system. The second is, please do your research on culture and make sure that you don't move to a country where the cultural values that people hold in that community clash with your own personal values. If there is no clash, I advise you to move. Before making a permanent move to an African country, it is advisable for you to first make a temporal move, for you to first go visit first to see if your spirit, your psyche agrees with that country before moving there, permanently. Don't just move. So I would never discourage anybody from coming to Africa. But however, if I'm being honest with myself, I have to tell you that there are these challenges do exist. I have to admit that some of these challenges do exist. But I guarantee you'll find a lot of fun things to do in Africa. Some of the advantages that you miss out on in the US, you will find new replacements for some of those pleasures and advantages when you get to Africa, because we do have our own, positive experiences to get. If you can afford it, visit and then think about it. And finally, I would advise you to make the move.